Okay, the point was, I apologize, that the title is Jeff Koons, Acknowledgement of Receipt of Duchamp's Telegram. The first thing I want to do, I Googled translator. Oh, this by way of an introduction, everybody knows that the rabbit sold for an astronomical price at Christie's last week. And so this is how it was presented, in a glowing religious aura that only money can provide today. And of course, people, including, as you can see, Andy Warhol, who came back from hell to photograph the rabbit, and behind Warhol, a whole crowd who wanted its share of the aura of this modern icon. So this was my title, and I needed to explain what an acknowledgement of receipt is, and the Google translation gave me accuse da recibo. So everybody knows what that means. When you get a registered letter, you have to sign a proof that you have received the letter. The post office keeps a copy as a proof that it has delivered the letter to you, and sometimes if the sender requests it, an acknowledgement of receipt is sent back to the sender so that the sender also has a proof. So that is the concept that I'm going to use here. Of course, I use it metaphorically. I mean to say that Duchamp sent you might say a telegram, or, here is accuse de recibo. In 1917, Marcel Duchamp sent a telegram, or you might say put a letter in the mail, or threw a message in a bottle. There are a number of metaphors that you can use, but that message took the shape of the photograph of a urinal with 3 captions: fountain by Armut, yes, photograph by Alfred Stieglitz, and the exhibit refused by the Independents. Then, around 1962, and it depends, of course, it starts in the 50s, it culminates in the mid-60s, and the later generation of the 70s are also going to have to deal with that. The telegram, the news, the letter arrives in the early 60s. I put the date of 1962 because I will show you one particular accuse de recibo of Duchamp's telegram. In Spanish, de Duchamp puedes poner cualquier cosa en esta caja. Right? So it is clear that the urinal, this is, first of all, Ben Vautier is a French artist who was a member of the Fluxus group, and this is his acknowledgement of receipt. Why is it an acknowledgement of receipt? Well, because in a way, the urinal had already been put in the art box, and once a urinal is in the art box, then you can put anything in the art box. This is what I take to be the understanding, the interpretation, or the acknowledgement of receipt of Duchamp's telegram, which is not exactly the same as to say this is what the telegram contains. It is how the telegram is interpreted. And it goes like this. I call this the Duchamp syllogism. This urinal is art. When a urinal is art, anything can be art. And some people even added, when anything can be art, anybody can be an artist. And you see, this is why the font is wrong. Anybody can be an artist. I'm giving you one more example of such an acknowledgement of receipt dated 1968 by Robert Filiou, Le principe d'équivalence, bien fait, mal fait, pas fait. Here is his stamp, in Spanish, bien hecho, mal hecho, no hecho. And in English, well made, badly made, not made. The reason I interpret this particular work as an acknowledgement or receipt of Duchamp's message is that the series well made, badly made, not made really brings to mind the fourth term that is missing, i.e. ready-made. So without the ready-made, I don't think Filiou would have thought of having these other three possibilities that Duchamp did not do. So what you see here is, actually it's a funny work, because the first on the left is a little piece of wood with three boxes with a little sock that his wife had knitted in one box and then badly knitted in the second and not knitted at all in the and then the first is there a pointer? No. The first thing is then replaced, is then multiplied 3 times, bien hecho, mal hecho, no hecho, then that block is multiplied again 3 times, and so on, and you can see that you could go like this ad infinitum. Okay, that's for one thing. And it so happens that Robert Filiou indeed is one of those people who finished the Duchamp syllogism: when a urinal is art, anything can be art, and anybody can be an artist. Si ahí estás, todo el mundo será un artista. Good, that's one. Now let me look at other people who have interpreted the message when it arrived in a similar way. Jack Burnham was a critic, and he writes, obviously it's no longer important who is or is not a good artist. The only sensible question is, why isn't everybody an artist? So Filiou prophesies it in the future. Burnham asks it, why is it not the case? And if you go to the very serious art critic Clement Greenberg, who is not a friend of Duchamp, he also acknowledges receipt, and perhaps this is the best acknowledgement of receipt on the part of a critic. If anything and everything can be intuited aesthetically, that's what he demonstrates in the first part of his article, then anything and everything can be intuited and experienced artistically. And he adds that this began to be seen only lately, thanks to Marcel Duchamp, for the most part, doesn't make it any the less so. And then he goes on, if this is so, then there turns out to be such a thing as art at large. Art that is or can be realized anywhere and at any time and by anybody. This is a very surprising statement from Greenberg. If you know a bit of Greenberg, you would be very surprised to hear that from his mouth. And then I switched to another, this time again an artist, Accusé de recibo of Duchamp's telegram. In 1964, Joseph Beuys did a televised performance in which he wrote on a piece of board here, Das Schweigen von Marcel Duchamp wird überbewertet, which means in English, the silence of Marcel Duchamp is overrated. So here is you see, acknowledgement of receipt is not the same thing as influence. Here is an artist who is not influenced by Duchamp, who is actually fighting against Duchamp, wants to take his place as the most famous artist, living artist at the time, and counteracts like that. And then years later, in explaining what he had done in this performance, here is what Joseph Beuys said. I criticized Duchamp because at the very moment when he could have developed a theory on the basis of the work he had accomplished, he kept silent. I am the one who today develops the theory he could have developed. He entered the urinal into the museum, I underlined this, and noticed that its transportation from one place to another made it into art. But he failed to draw the clear and simple conclusion that every human being is an artist. This is Beuys's criticism to Duchamp. Now let us check. He entered the urinal into museum. Well, the original urinal never entered a museum because the photo was taken in 1917. We have another photo that apparently dates from 1918, and then the urinal vanished, and we don't know what happened to it. No one knows, not one specialist of Duchamp knows where it is. So we have to wait until 1950 to see a reincarnation of the urinal, which is this time a different model, close but not the same, which Sidney Janis, a gallerist from New York, found on a Paris flea market to put in a show of surrealist objects. You will see that later, to which he wanted Duchamp to participate. Then the urinal reappears in yet another guise. Ulf Linder, this time a Swedish art critic, it's also a funny story, found this particular urinal in the men's room of his favorite Stockholm restaurant. And he exchanged it for a new one with the owner of the restaurant. And then he put the 1917, the signature and so on, in block letters, and later on Duchamp, when he came to Stockholm, signed it with his handwriting. And finally, in 1964, Arturo Schwarz, a Milan gallerist, asked Duchamp permission to produce a series of 8 copies plus 2 artists' copies plus 2 exhibition copies of 13 ready-mades, and most of them are in the show at the Jumex, and this is, of course, his. So Beuys claims that Duchamp put a urinal into the museum. This one entered the Gallery of Canada in 71, the Paris Pompidou in 86, the Tate Modern only in 99, and if you want the whole list, I'm not going to read this for you, but you can believe me, the only urinal that entered the museum in Duchamp's lifetime is the first one, the Ulf Linder replica, which was donated to the Stockholm Moderna Museum in 1965. Of course, with Duchamp's permission, but with a label pour copie conforme, for a registered copy, you might say. And then you have the whole list, and then, of course, Joseph Beuys dies in 1986, and there are still a number of urinals that are donated or most of the time purchased by museums later after Beuys's death. So here are the 4 models that we have seen until now, and I'm going fast because I have lots of things to say, and I abused your patience already. So Fountain entered the museum late in Duchamp's life, and I want to underline this, thanks to other people. Duchamp always managed to have other people express the desire to put his ready-mades into a museum, and he carefully failed, or even did not even call them out himself. But then the next question is, when did Duchamp really acknowledge paternity of Fountain? That is, you see there's missing text, when did he take responsibility for having sent a telegram or a message in a bottle, etc.? We go back to the blind man, because I didn't tell you that the photo accompanied with these 3 captions was actually a double page with, on the opposite side, an editorial in a little magazine which had been printed in at the most 200 copies and hand distributed after the show had closed, so that very, very few people actually laid their eyes on this double page. And then there is a Richard Mudd case here which explains the scandal that did not happen. Namely, that the exhibit here, as the caption underneath says, the exhibit was refused by the Independents. More about them later. So Duchamp's name appears nowhere here. It appears in the cover on the cover of the magazine and elsewhere in an article, but without connection with the Richard Mutt affair. The next time we see Duchamp really acknowledge paternity for the urinal, you have to wait until 1945. This is the cover and the back cover, like this, of View magazine, designed by Duchamp, and the magazine contains an article by Harriet and Sidney Janis, the same Sidney Janis who had found the urinal in Paris, Marcel Duchamp, anti-artist, which reproduced Stieglitz's photograph. So between 1917 and 1945, you can say there might at the most be 10 people on the planet Earth that knew who was behind this thing. And then the article was reprinted in Motherwell's anthology, The Dada Painters and Poets, from 1951, where, interestingly enough, Motherwell, commenting on the bottle rack, wrote, "It is also a subtle solution to an essential Dada dilemma, how to express oneself without art when all means of expressions are potentially artistic." This is, to my knowledge, the very first acknowledgement of receipt, the very first time somebody deduces from Duchamp's gesture that now anything can be art. You see, all means of expressions are potentially artistic. And this dates from 1951. So we're back to the 1950s with the urinal that Janis found in Paris, and he shows it in his gallery in the Challenge and Defy group show in 1950. And as you can see, it is shown in a very interesting way. And I quote from a letter from Duchamp to Sidney Janis, "Please hang it low so that even little boys could use it." Not at all sitting on a table, as in the Stieglitz photograph. And of course not connected to the plumbing, so that if you use it, you're pissing on the carpet. But that's it. So this is a photo in a group show of surrealists. You can see a Delvaux, a Dali, a Magritte, and a Max Ernst here. And the same urinal reappears in the same gallery 3 years later, this time in an even more original exhibition way, hanging above the upside down, above the door, with a sprig of mistletoe underneath. So, you know, it was probably at the end of the show was in December, so this is probably taken around New Year's Eve, where people are supposed to kiss under the mistletoe. It's a good thing. So you see the humor of it all. When the urinal reappears, it's also very confidential, because that gallery was catering to a relatively small community of artists and avant-garde collectors. And here you can see a Picabia room, and then behind that, the Duchamp room. The next time you see the urinal reappear in a museum situation, it has never been in a museum situation until now, is 1961, the Art of Assemblage Show curated by William Zeitz at MoMA in New York, where you can see it is in the Duchamp room. He has his name on the room, and there are a couple of other ready-mades there. This is the Janis copy. And finally, in 1963, the Janis copy lands in what is now the very first retrospective by Duchamp. So he's 75 years old, and he finally has a retrospective. And at that moment, you can say the urinal becomes really public. What you see behind the urinal, it might strike you as, and here, I will satisfy your curiosity. This is Duchamp posing, playing chess with a naked woman whose name is Eve Babbitt, and who's an artist from LA, and she's still alive and well today. And the large glass, the copy of the large glass, which also was done by Ulf Linde in Stockholm, was also in the show. And you can see the urinal is in the corner on the right side there. And so here are the other ready-mades in that show. So I insist that this is the first time the ready-mades are shown in public in a museum situation. But a couple of months before the Pasadena retrospective, thanks to Ulf Linde again, the Galerie Buren in Stockholm installed, this is a reconstruction, we have no photos of the time, a reconstruction of the installation of the Galerie Buren. And you can see here that the Linde copy of the urinal has now, you can see that the signature was changed, and it's now Duchamp's handwriting that has authenticated the object. What I'm interested in is that the way the ready-made, the urinal is installed. It is installed, as you can see, on a brick base. I'm not going to talk about that, with the pliant de voyage hanging above, and then you can see a little flash of light above. Let me give you a better photo. You can see an enlargement. You can see a glass file floating here, and on the left you have the Pasadena installation, and on the right you have the Stockholm installation, separated by a few months. And both curators who did not, or maybe they did after all, I don't know if they talked to each other, but they both decided that they would adopt this particular installation for the urinal. And again, this is not, it's the second time the urinal appears in a museum situation, but it's the first time it appears in a retrospective of Duchamp. So in order to understand that particular arrangement of those three ready-mades, we have to go back elsewhere. The question is now, why did the curators of the Stockholm and the Pasadena shows, Ulf Linde and Walter Hopps, show those three ready-mades in this particular arrangement? And the text was going, what kind of legitimation were they trying to give to those ready-mades? You must understand that in 1963, it was still problematic to call a ready-made urinal a work of art. You had to find a legitimation. And the legitimation is the esoteric connection between those ready-mades and the large glass, as you will see. But here is again the photo of the Pasadena show and reproductions of the three ready-mades in question. In order to understand this, we have to go back in time again to the boîte en valise. Now, the boîte en valise was originated in a project in 1936, when Duchamp decided to make a book with all his work in it. And then the book turned out to become a suitcase, a valise, a suitcase, with reproductions, very, very meticulously done reproductions of all his ready-mades. The valise is in the show at the Jumex, so you can go and see it. And as you can see, those three ready-mades are there in the particular arrangement that I showed you in Stockholm and in Pasadena. The urinal is on the lower side, on the level of the bachelor's domain of the last glass. The file of Paris Air is at the level of the bride's domain on top, and in the middle, the underwood cover is at the level of the horizon, which is also called in the mythology of the large glass the bride's dress, la robe de la mariée, the bride's dress. And given Duchamp's taste for eroticism and puns, and given the relationship we don't know exactly, that he has had at the time of the urinal with Beatrice Wood, the underwood cover is like the skirt of Beatrice that you would like to peep underneath. So at the level of the bride's dress. Interestingly enough, Duchamp was not ready to divulge the trick of these three ready-mades to the large public yet. So the boîte en valise began its production in 1941. The first was given to Peggy Guggenheim, and then a few collectors bought one or two, and they were very slow in the making. By the end of the 40s, no more than 20 had been done, and then there were more made later on. So this is to say that a very small circle knew about the Duchamp and the paternity of the ready-mades, and in particular of the urinal. You can see here that when this photo appears in Time magazine in 1942, the compartment where the three little models were supposed to be are not there. The compartment is still empty. Now, if we do have a look at this compartment, there we find the very first acknowledgement of authorship or paternity, if you want, of the urinal. It's accompanied with a label that says Fountain by Richard Mudd, ready-made, and then in French, auteur 60 centimeters, etc., New York, 1917. So, does Duchamp really acknowledge paternity? No. Fountain is by Richard Mudd, but it is now incorporated in a portable museum of Duchamp's work. So you have an ambiguous acknowledgement, recognition of that ready-made object. But that is 1941, 42, and very few people knew of it. Here is a little model, and here you can see, I love these little objects, they're so cute. The one on the left is the papier-mâché models, after which the one on the right, no, the one on the right is the papier-mâché model, after which the one on the left is the porcelain cast that was in the boîte en valise, in the deluxe version. Because the boîte en valise came in two versions, a deluxe version where it was actually packed in a leather suitcase, and a non-deluxe where it's cardboard box. And so the non-deluxe had a plaster urinal, and the deluxe edition had a porcelain urinal. So this brings us back to 1917, and it said that Duchamp only and still very late in life and indirectly acknowledged paternity of Fountain in the boîte en valise. This is in turn what Ulf Linde and Walter Hobbs acknowledge or recognize in their installation. But it is only after the Pasadena show that Duchamp took full responsibility for having sent his telegram. You might say he takes full responsibility for being the author of the ready-mades also, but I interpret the whole thing as a telegram put in the mail in the guise of a photo, the whole thing, the rest, you know some of the story now. So it's only when he agreed to have Schwartz produce an edition of his ready-mades that he really became the author of the ready-mades. So here are a few of the Schwartz copies or replicas. They're all in the show here. And this is the MoMA copy or exemplar of the replica of Fountain, which you can see here in front of a Pollock painting at MoMA in 2017, which it's not always shown at MoMA, but it was shown for the centenary of the urinal, of course. Now, what does the telegram actually say? I'm saying that the telegram is without other comment, that photo, the three captions, and the editorial speaking of the blind man, but more about that a little later. So one thing is what the telegram says, another thing is how the telegram is interpreted. Now let's get back to Joseph Beuys' critique. He entered the urinal into the museum and noticed that its transportation from one place to another made it into art. That's not the story at all. It landed in the museum only after it was made into art by different means. And then Beuys says he failed to draw the clear and simple conclusion that every human being is an artist. So Beuys is thinking, but he's completely disingenuous. Because if you know the art of Joseph Beuys, you know that he didn't get any kind of lesson from Duchamp. He gets his idea that every human being is an artist from Rudolf Steiner, who gets it from Novalis and the Romantic poets of the end of the 18th century. That's the tradition, the German Romantic tradition in which Joseph Beuys situates itself. So he's being disingenuous, but it's a perfect example of the Duchamp syllogism. This urinal is art. When a urinal is art, anything can be art, and when anything can be art, anybody can be an artist. Well, this is wrong. That is why I wanted that font. I scratched that line, and the truth is, it's not when anything can be art, then anybody can be an artist. The truth is, when anybody can be an artist, then anything could be art. It's strange that it has not been analyzed and studied in the Duchamp literature until I came around. Because this is the subject of my next book, the Duchamp's Telegram. So that was very self-serving, I apologize. When anybody can be an artist, anything can be art. So why is it not when anything can be art, anybody can be an artist, but rather when anybody can be an artist, anything can be art? In order to understand that, we have to peel the onion here. We have to go from one strata of the telegram to another. We have to go back to the circumstances that saw the Richard Mudd case appear. We are in New York in 1916, and a group of artists, frustrated by the jury of the exhibition at the National Academy of Design in New York, gathered in the home of the Arensbergs, a couple of eccentric collectors who would befriend Duchamp later on, had befriended Duchamp by that time already. And so Duchamp was in that group, and they were discussing the creation of a new society of artists that would liberate themselves from the jury of the National Academy. And here is what the announcement for the creation of that society says. There are no requirements for admission to the society, save the acceptance of its principles, which boils down to no jury, no prizes, and the payment of the initiation fee of $1 and the annual dues of $5. All exhibitors are thus members, or if you prefer, all members are exhibitors, and have a vote for the directors on the decisions made by the society and at its annual meetings. Here is the cover of the catalogue of the first annual exhibition in 1917 from April 10th to May 6th, and the one and only principle of the society is printed right underneath. You can see it, no jury, no prizes. So it's a very democratic group of artists. More about that in a minute. So now the opening, the show opens on April 9th for the VIPs. It's the vernissage for the VIPs. The large public comes the next day. And on the night of the opening, a few people distribute those copies of that little magazine, The Blind Man. It's advertised as the Independence number. It is dated from the first day of the exhibition, and underneath you have the second number of The Blind Man will appear as soon as you have sent sufficient material for it. So the readers are going to be the writers of the second number. What happens during the show? We know, because I've shown you the photo at the very introduction of my talk, that the exhibit was refused by the independents. But does the public know that? No. And this is something also that I'll beg you to pardon me for being so pretentious, but it's wrong in almost every book on Duchamp that there was a scandal at the Society of the Independent. There was no scandal. Yes, there was a mini scandal inside the board of directors, who indeed refused to show the urinal. But there are many conflicting stories. If we have time in the question period, I can tell you about some of these stories. But the thing is, the journalists never got to know it. The public never got to know it. The cartoonists never got to know it. Imagine that if there had been a urinal in the show, those cartoonists would have had a field day making fun of that. Do you see a urinal here? No. This is now a second. This cartoon appears on the day of the closing of the exhibition. Exeunt, independent artists, Latin for they go away. And look, I'm enlarging a few of these things. Funny, you may have your old quilt back, Grandma. Nobody would buy it. That's that's one thing. Here is the removal squad at works. They're catching modern sculpture with a lasso. Here is an abstract painting foot kicking a spectator in the face, and so on. Do you see a urinal? No urinal. So there is no scandal, no public scandal. The only two leaks in the press speak of a piece of bathroom furniture or a bathroom fixture. That's not a urinal. So nobody knew what it was. And according to some of the press clippings, it was not even clear whether it was the object itself or a painting representing the object, which would have been a kind of modern still life. Okay, the show closes, no scandal. In May, probably on the day of the closing or a little later, the second number of The Blind Man appears. And on the cover, as you can see, is the chocolate grinder signed by Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp's name appears on the cover. And then you open the magazine, and on the second or third page, you find the famous editorial and the famous photo. Let's focus on the editorial. They say any artist paying $6 may exhibit. Mr. Richard Mutt sent in a fountain. Without discussion, this artist disappeared and never was exhibited. What were the grounds for refusing Mr. Mutt's fountain? 1, some contended it was immoral, vulgar. 2, others it was plagiarism, a plain piece of plumbing. Now, Mr. Mutt's fountain is not immoral, that is absurd. No more than a bathtub is immoral. It's a fixture that you see every day in plumbers' show windows. Whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object, and then finally, as for plumbing, that is absurd. The only works of art America has given are her plumbing and her bridges. The editorial is not signed. Most scholars believe it is Beatrice Wood, who was one of the 3 accomplices with Duchamp in the thing, who wrote it. I suspect that Duchamp more or less dictated it to Beatrice Wood, because you can feel his hand in here. But if I may, do I have the time? How much is there a limit? Because I'm rushing through this, but you might want to. No, okay. So I want to underline a few things which are also in the book that is about to be ready now. There are several things in in this editorial that seemed to hint that the urinal was art already before Mr. Mutt chose it. So it is not Duchamp who claimed by scandal as a gesture of anti-art that a urinal can be art. As you ought to know by now, it's the rules of the Society of Independent Artists that make the object into art. Except that they censored it, they did not abide by their own rules. But if you look at this, he said Mr. Mutt sent in a fountain, not fountain capitalized and italicized like the title of a work of art. As we know, the fountain is a work of art. No, a fountain. And then it's called Mr. Mutt's fountain. And so, but the thing, others contended that it was plagiarism. You cannot plagiarize an ordinary object. You can only plagiarize a work of art. So it seems like it's already. And then it's on top of the second paragraph, it's a fixture that you see every day in plumbers' show windows. You would expect every day that you would see it in a men's room, at least if you're a gentleman. The ladies are not supposed to go there, but in a show windows. So some scholars have done the research. I didn't do it, but I really recognize my debt to them. Looking at show windows of plumbing and bathroom fixture at the time, and there are dozens of testimonies that treat bathroom fixtures as if they were art. And there was even a museum in New Jersey that exhibited toilets as art before the urinal affair, before 1917, actually in 1915. But of course, this was good commercial strategy. It's also, maybe we're all too young for that, of course, but to own a porcelain bathroom in 1917 was a sign of social status. It was high-class bourgeois thing. So there we are. So when the last sentence arrives, the only works of art America has given are her plumbing and her bridges. That's where I thought, only a European could write that, not an American. So it's not Beatrice Wood. It's some, and then maybe I'm wrong, because as Kirk Vanderdoe, among others, has found out, there were advertisements in the trade journals of the plumbing industry that showed that toilets and bathroom fixtures could be treated as art. Okay. My point with this talk, this was an excursus, did not plan to do this, is that the first sentence says, "They say any artist paying $6 may exhibit." And indeed, the bylaws of the Society of Independent Artists state, any artist, whether a citizen of the United States or of any foreign country, may become a member of the Society upon filing an application, therefore, paying the initiation fee and the annual dues of a member, $6 in total, and exhibiting at the exhibition in the years that he joined. They don't tell you who is an artist and who is not. They don't tell you what the criteria are for being an artist. They don't ask the members, if you want to take your membership card, for the proof that you're an artist. They don't ask you for your degree, your diploma of an art school. They don't ask you to show a portfolio of works. No, anyone could join. So one journalist did not miss that. Step up, ladies and gentlemen, pay $6 and be an artist, an independent artist. Cheap, isn't it? Yet that is all it costs. You and I, even if we've never wielded a brush, can buy $6 worth of wall space at the Grand Central Palace, where the exhibition was held. So you see, it is not Duchamp who transgressed all aesthetic boundaries. It is the Society of Independent Artists who did, not realizing that by creating a society in which anybody could be a member without any kind of entrance examination, they were open the door to the anything goes. So it is when anybody can be an artist, then it follows that anything can be art. And Duchamp merely took them at their word. Aha, this is so, let's try, let's see. And then, of course, he got censored. So I'm not done with my story yet, before we get to Jeff Koons. Since when is it the case that anybody can be an artist? And the answer, you see, if you remember, Filiu, Burnham, Greenberg, Beuys, everybody thinks, oh, the answer is since the 1960s. No, 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 no. At least since 1916, since the creation of the Society of Independent Artists. Now, the Society of Independent Artists in New York was modeled after the Société des Artistes Indépendants in Paris. They simply borrowed their rules and just translated them into English. And that was created in 1884. So let's pause a little bit. Anybody can be an artist, in certain contexts at least, since 1884. Now, in 1884, the Société des Artistes Indépendants is actually, if you want to understand the next question about independence, you have to go back to 1648. I'm making the story extremely condensed, but still I needed to go back there. What happened in 1648? That is when the Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture, pardon my French, was founded. Very quickly, the king, Louis XIV, is only 10 years old. Mazarin is the man in power. His mother is the queen regent. There's political problems. The king receives a letter from a certain Martin de Charmois, who wants the king to acknowledge that painters are noblemen amidst noblemen and so on. It's the old claim of painting being a liberal art rather than a manual art, but it starts with the sentence, Sire, the Académie des peintres et des sculpteurs, and then the complaint goes on against the guilds of St. Luke, which was dominating the Paris art scene at the time. But the Académie did not exist. So it was a gambit. It was almost like a mini coup d'etat to force the hand of the king, who was 10 years old. So anyway, Mazarin understood the political advantage he could done, and that was the origin of the Académie. The Académie, the short story is the following: in exchange for that gambit on the part of the artists, because behind Louis de Charmois there was Charles Lebrun, who would become the first director of the Académie. In exchange for their newly acquired status of intellectuals and aristocrats, the painters got their hands tied with the French state. And it starts with, of course, the little boy of the previous painting grows up to become the solar king that we know, le droit soleil, who says, l'État c'est moi, I am the state. So I'm cutting a long story short, but you see, you already begin to understand that the Society of Independent Artists, or rather the French Société des Artistes Indépendants, was a response to something that you might describe as the monopoly of the French state over the career of artists. That's a long story also, but this is what I want you to understand. The word indépendant appears for the first time around 78, but I don't have a poster for the 78 exhibition. But as you might know, the Impressionists around Monet, Pissarro, Sisley and others. The group changes all the time, by the way. But they stopped showing at the Salon as of 1874, and they had a dealer that allowed them to escape the Salon system, and they organized exhibitions, some of which was under the banner of artistes indépendants. So the Impressionists, not always called themselves indépendants. They were not always in agreement with each other. That's also a long story, but that's the name artistes indépendants comes up in connection with the Impressionists. And then the Société des Artistes Indépendants is created in 84, and here you have the receipt of the membership card of Engrand, Monsieur Engrand, 3 francs, 3 francs. Remember $6, 3 francs. So you see, it's cheap to become an artist in Paris in 1884 also. In art history books, the Société des Indépendants is mostly mentioned in connection with Seurat, because he was one of the founding members, and he showed Une baignade à Asnières in the first salon, and he showed Un dimanche à la Grande Jatte in the second salon in 86, which is a very ambitious painting. And so most art history books speak of the Salon des Indépendants as the breakout of neo-impressionism, pointillism, divisionism, whatever. This is not totally false, but one should not forget that the bulk, the immense majority of the independent artists who took their membership of that society were disgruntled artists who had been ejected from the official salon, refused from the official salon, or amateur artists who would not even dare show at a salon at all. So the interesting thing is that out of the 402 artists, I went through the whole list, there are only these 7 names that art historians know. And the general public might know Seurat and Signac, and perhaps Odilon Redon, after which it becomes an affair of specialists who are the others. But these are the 7 names that art history books have remembered, and all the others are gone. So let's go back now to a few press clippings from the first exhibition of the Indépendants. The first exhibition, by the way, happened even before the society was incorporated. Independent of whom? Of what? Before penetrating the barracks at the Tuileries, where the show was held, one imagines discovering new experiments, bold attempts, or to stay with the program posted at the door. Independences. Once inside, though, one wonders. There's no independence at all. What you see are all the familiar traditions from the Metropolitan Palace of the Champs-Élysées, where the official salon is held, and you ask yourself whether you didn't take the wrong way. So you see, that's a very different opinion than from the art historians of the future. Geoffroy, same question. First of all, independent of what? Was it worth taking up for Bannard the qualification brandished by Degas, Miscassat, Raphael, Pissarro, and their friends, the Impressionists? Was it worth breaking with the artists who accept a venue from the state only in order to exhibit the banal paintings on display these days in the pavilion lent for lack of state support by the city of Paris? We begin to see independence of whom, of what. And one more. It is not difficult to find one's way through this heap of paintings and sculpture that calls itself, I don't know why, the Salon des Indépendants. Independent of whom? Of what? Always the same question. Is it independent of the Salon jury, which would have refused to admit 200 or 300 ridiculous or hideous canvases or sculpture? And the answer is, of course, yes. It is independent of the Salon jury, and behind this, I must say in one word, behind the Salon jury is independent of the monopoly of the French state over the career of artists. And in fact, when the Salon des Indépendants opened, the system had already collapsed. This is the 1880 Salon, official Salon de Jury, and as you can see, they had about 40 seconds per painting to decide whether it was in or out. And then that salon was a catastrophe. Turquet, the organizer, the curator of the salon, who was a very powerful man in the Ministère des Beaux-Arts, succeeded in antagonizing all the artists by hanging his protégés in the best places and all the others elsewhere, and by installing electric lights that the people didn't like because it made all the paintings yellow, and so on and so on. So Bougreau, who was the president of the jury, stepped down. Somebody, I don't remember whom, stepped up, stepped down, and finally it was a financial disaster. The press was very critical of the salon, and the result, here is a view of the salon with the sculpture floor, and in the Palais de l'Industrie, that's where it was, and finally the state says, and that's the end. We are not going to sponsor you anymore. This is by Edmond Turquet, the man I just mentioned, addressing the artists and in public, and then it's published in the next salon. You must now entirely take charge of the free material and artistic management of the actual exhibitions in replacement of the administration. The state will no longer intervene in your business. Experience has sufficiently demonstrated that there is no possible compromise between complete management by the state and free management by the artists. So it's interesting, and then of course I must add to this, as it usually is in politics, you don't like to lose power. So the next thing they did is, oh my God, we lost power of the salon. We must recuperate that power. So they hired Messonnier to organize an anti-salon, which was called the Triennale, and which was supposed to be the super select, and so on and so on. But it all collapsed. So by the time the Indépendant was created, the Beaux-Arts system, the French Beaux-Arts system, had already collapsed. And it is very important because all this is connected to a question, which is, why was modernism born in France? Why was the avant-garde born in France and not elsewhere? I think there were particular, very, very particular conditions of work for the artists, and one of them was the monopoly that the French state exercised over the career of artists throughout their life, unless there were medals, at which point they did not have to submit their work to the jury. So the Beaux-Arts system is gone. Anything can be art, anybody can be an artist. When you peel the onion of Duchamp's telegram, what it finally means is that the Beaux-Arts system has collapsed. Now, when one Beaux-Arts system collapses, another takes its place. Enter what I call the art in general system, in which anything can be art, and anybody can be an artist. But you see, it is not in the 60s that this happened. It is almost a century before. It is in 1880 that the system collapsed. And I see that wonderful period between the 1880s and the 1960s as the heyday of high modernism with Impressionism, Neo-Impressionism, Cubism, Futurism, Dadaism, Constructivism, Surrealism, you name it, until the end of the 60s, when people began to be uncertain with that and began to speak of postmodernism. So, but those 80 years are almost, it's, if you, I'll go do it for you. This is 1880, this is 1916, this is 1962, right? The content of Duchamp's message pertains to this event here. And the news that the system has collapsed arrives only in 1962. And then artists, so this is now my second chapter after the long And excuse me that this was very long, but this is the story of the telegram and what it, according to me, means. So now, artists from the 60s, 70s, and so on acknowledge receipt of Duchamp's message in a staggering variety of ways. Not every work done in that period accounts for an acknowledgement of receipt, of course, and so there is room for a whole generation of new art historians to work on that. I'm serious there. I hope my students will, some of them will do that. So for example, of course, the one that I already quoted at the beginning, that's a very direct accuse de recibo. Or, for example, this is an excerpt from a Fluxus manifesto where the artist, to establish his non-professional status in society, must demonstrate that anything can be art and anyone can do it. This phrase is usually attributed to George Brecht, whom you might know as a famous Fluxus artist. Now, the scatological connotations of a urinal and a toilet was not lost on Piero Manzoni, who, as you know, in 1961 produced Merda l'Artista. And to show you the many different ways, some serious, some humoristic, and so on, here is, for example, an announcement for his show at Castelli by Robert Rauschenberg, also dated 1961. Rather than showing you a well-known work by Rauschenberg, I show you this because it's all junk. It's really n'importe quoi, as they say in French, you know. Junk lying on the studio floor, probably because there's a brush in a white can of paint there, and scattered is, second week in November, Rauschenberg, and very small Castelli on a piece of crumbled paper. I wonder why Castelli has accepted to publish this. That's pretty courageous, because it's not very good advertising. But it is, to quote Leo Steinberg, who wrote famously of Rauschenberg, that he had invented a new medium, which is the flatbed, like a surface where anything can be put there. The images and so on. So instead of having the window as a model for painting, Rauschenberg invents the printing press flatbed and this is a beautiful example and not a very well known of that. I think that to Rauschenberg's creative gesture is precisely to say, now, if anything goes, I need a surface where anything can go together and make something out of that. Now, interestingly enough, Duchamp himself acknowledged receipt of his own message. This is the poster for the first retrospective in Pasadena. And it's called a poster within a poster. And as you know, the poster within a poster, because it's in the show, is the wanted poster from 1923, where $2,000 reward are given to finding the criminal, who is also known under the name Rose Sélavy. Interestingly enough, in the 60s, only a few years after Duchamp put the poster within a poster, you see, with his handwriting, so that now the culprit has been found, two artists already did a replica of Duchamp's. And this is going to be very typical of the acknowledgements of receipt of the next generation, but I must say that they were ahead of their time, because in 1969, Sturtevant, Elaine Sturtevant, whose whole career is to make fake Stellas, fake Jasper Johns, fake this and that, which are not fakes because they are authentic Sturtevants, Pettibone, Richard Pettibone, also began his career by doing fakes, and they all did a replica of Duchamp's wanted poster with, of course, their own mugshots in it. And finally, I want to give you a more theoretical acknowledge of receipt, but on the part of an artist. When Joseph Kosuth publishes his famous text Art After Philosophy, he writes, "It is Marcel Duchamp whom we can credit with giving art its own identity. All art after Duchamp is conceptual in nature because art only exists conceptually." Here again we must pause that the acknowledgement of receipt of Duchamp's message pushed an artist to such extreme statement as to say that art had no identity before Duchamp came around. Isn't that a little much? A little much. Good. Now, this is my last chapter. What about the artists of the 80s? So this is the artists of the late 60s, early 60s already, Rauschenberg and so on, then late 60s, the conceptual artists. And let's jump to the 80s because that's the generation to which Jeff Koons belongs. They also had to acknowledge receipt of Duchamp's message, but at a remove. They had to acknowledge the very facts that their immediate predecessors had acknowledged receipt. And so I'm showing, and all of a sudden you see a number of artists producing ready-mades and putting ready-mades on shelves, adding ready-made on top of another ready-made, modifying a ready-made in this or that way. Chaim Steinbach, you know him. He did a number of shelves that are more or less Don Judd-like, with banal objects that he purchased in stores on top of them. I don't have the exact, couldn't find the exact titles of these pieces. So this is quite typical. Here is, of course, there are a number of artists who actually redid the urinal, and several of them women, which is very interesting, but it's another subject. Sherry Levine did 2 copies. The first one from 1991, where the model is obviously not the same as Duchamp, and the second in 1996, where the model is very, very, very close to the one that Duchamp produced, the original one. And I wonder where she found the model for this. She's not the only one. Mike Bidlow, who titles his works Not, and then follows like he did the Brillo box titled Not Warhol. So this one is not Duchamp. Interestingly enough, it's also gold, but it's not gilded. It's ceramics. And then he broke it and put it back together. And he did here gilded bottle racks. Another artist whom you might not know, because he's not that known on this side of the Atlantic, is Bertrand Lavier, a French artist who in the beginning of the 80s began to paint on objects, literally painting on the object, the canon, so the painting is superimposed on the object. And he always gives the title is always the brand of the object that he has painted over. And then in the towards the mid-80s, he did combinations of 2 objects, which he always called this, on, that, sur, brand sur Hafner, which means that it is a brand refrigerator placed on a Hafner safe. And then this work exists in another variation, Brand sur Fichet Bauche, where it's another brand of safe that is underneath. And here, IKEA on Zanussi, an IKEA piece of ready-made furniture on a freezer by the Italian brand Zanussi. Okay, the early career of Charles Ray is also quite interesting. This is the ink box that he did in 1986, and the references of that generation are very often simultaneously to minimal and conceptual art and to the ready-made. Katharina Fritsch in Germany with a Madonna figure, 1987. And of course, a great Mexican artist. He does very different work now, Gabriel Orozco. You must know him, I suppose, but he became very well known for this work, which is a modified DS-19. You know that. And so finally, what was Koons' acknowledgement of receipt in that context? And I'm going to go very fast because you know the answer. First came the inflatable flowers, ready-made, straight out of the shop, with maybe a mirror behind to present them. The inflatable flower and bunny, which then became the model for the famous rabbit, which will come later, because I'm going chronologically. 79. So he was very early in that acknowledgement. And it's not surprising that he combines, again, he combines Dan Flavin and Duchamp here with the vacuum cleaners and the lights. My slides are not very good, but in the show you can see how brilliant the light is and how so. And then the one ball total equilibrium tank, which I think is a masterpiece. I noticed that the ball had gone all the way to the right. I don't know if it's a political sign or not, but I push it back to the left a little bit. It wouldn't hurt. And then, unfortunately, it's not in the show, but this is, for me, is complete masterpiece. Now you must understand that, first of all, I am not a complete Duchamp freak. I am rather critical of Duchamp, but I thought Duchamp was a fantastic messenger about the conditions in which art had found itself. But if you want me, if you ask me seriously, who do you think the greatest artists of the 20th century have been, I would put Matisse and Picasso and Mondrian ahead of Duchamp. That's my personal opinion. But Duchamp is the messenger, and nobody else has been so precise in his message. And then, of course, my education as a hardcore modernist art historian was not ready for Jeff Koons and the kind of kitsch that Jeff Koons has. But year after year, I found myself, in some occasions and in front of certain pieces, capitulating before a Jeff Koons piece. And the Michael Jackson and Bubbles, I happened to have been in Oslo by complete chance because I missed my plane and I had a free day to spend in Oslo. So I went to the Astrup Fearnley Museum where that piece is a month ago, and I photographed it because I didn't know I was going to do this talk, or maybe it was 2 months ago, but I didn't know that yet. But I wanted to photograph the details because the devil is in the details, and Jeff Koons is completely devilish. That's no doubt about that. And the details and the how should I say, obsessiveness, with the maniacal obsessiveness with which he is a perfectionist. And to take the surface appearance of objects. I like the Octavio Paz title that you gave to the exhibition, but it is beyond the stripping bare of appearance. It is making the appearance the thing that's going to bedazzle you to a point that is remarkable. And if you spend enough time, with that piece here, if you look at not only Michael Jackson's eyes, but also Bubbles' eyes, long enough, it becomes poignant. It becomes human. It becomes everything that on the surface it is not. And the details, and the craftsmanship, And of course, everybody knows, I know one's grandmother may have had a little piece of Saxony porcelain, but it's this big. This thing is life-size. You know, it's incredible. So I must say that the shininess, the obsessive perfection of the craftsmanship is what makes the best pieces by Jeff Koons really, really, really great art. And what I found moving also is that he had the craftsman of this piece sign the piece. Nowhere you have Jeff Koons' signature, but you have Villari's signature, who's probably the artisan who made this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.